You are listening to KZSC's Voces, Critícas, Critical Voices. I am your producer and host, Silvana Falcón. I'm here live with TJ Demos, professor in the Department of the History of Art and Visual Culture here at UC Santa Cruz, and he is the founder and director of its Center for Creative Ecologies. He writes widely on the intersection of contemporary art, global politics, and ecology, and is the author of numerous books, including the latest book, Against the Anthropocene, Visual Culture and Environment Today, Decolonizing Nature, Contemporary Art and the Politics of Ecology, The Migrant Image, The Art and Politics of Documentary During Global Crisis, winner of the College Art Association's 2014 Frank Jewett Mather Award, and Return to the Post-Colonial, Specters of Colonialism and Contemporary Art. Demos co-curated Rights of Nature, Art and Ecology in the Americas at Nottingburg Contemporary in January 2015 and organized Spectras, a Cine Politics of Haunting at the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid in 2014. Welcome, TJ, to Voces Critícas.
Thanks, Silvana. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. Let's talk about this book. And I think the first thing we need to do in terms of talking about the book is actually explaining what Anthropocene means. And we're apparently in the era of the Anthropocene. What does Anthropocene mean?
So the term really has, by this point, many meanings. I think it was defined, first of all, around 2000 by the scientists Eugene Stormer and Paul Crutzen. Stormer is a biologist and Crutzen an atmospheric chemist. And they proposed the term as a new geological descriptor to designate the present era, which for them was one where Earth's natural processes are defined by human activities. So that means if we're thinking of climate changes, of the ways our Earth, river, seas, oceans are changed by human activities, by industrialization, by modernization, by impacts in the atmosphere, chemical inputs, all sorts of industrial pollutants. This is really what the Anthropocene then is attempting to define. But it really has many meanings. That essay was around 2000, and by 2018 there's been a lot of different approaches to mobilizing the term within the sciences, within the social sciences and humanities and the arts as well. So I think increasingly we'll be able to talk about multiple receptions of the term, and not all of them are in agreement. And I think this is where my book makes an intervention in terms of attempting to inject some critical thinking and interrogation in relationship to the term's conceptualization, its various meanings, and also implications as well as ideological values.
So one of the things your work does also is arguing for a different representation about the global environmental crisis. And we're talking a lot about climate crisis and other kinds of environmental crises. I want you to explain a little bit more what your concerns are with the existing representation about climate change or environmental crises, even more generally than that.
I think the Anthropocene is actually a representation of global environmental crisis in one way or another. The implication is that we've exited the Holocene, which is the geological epoch that comes before the Anthropocene and has been in existence for roughly 12,000 years. So the fact that we've shifted into a new biogeophysical paradigm really is not at all necessarily a good thing or positive. As we know, it's really filled with all sorts of crises that could spell, in many ways, disaster, even catastrophe for civilization as we know it. So the problems that I bring out with the term in the book Against the Anthropocene have to do fundamentally with the way it names this epoch. So the term Anthropocene is, of course, based on the root word anthropos, which is Greek for human beings or man. And what that means is the term is proposing that human species being is really the agent of environmental transformation. It's the central driver for what we're seeing now, which we could call climate breakdown. And that proposes an undifferentiated agent behind the causality, the sets of vulnerabilities and the effects of climate transformation, which is profoundly problematic. One reason for that is that it removes any kind of political approach to, I think, an environmental justice-based framework for addressing transformations in our environmental conditions. So in asserting species being, that universalized agency behind climate change, it basically refuses to acknowledge, or it neglects to point out, that environmental transformation hasn't been the result of equal participation in this project of industrialization, of modernization, of the massive forms of pollution, of air and land pollution that we've seen that is bringing the climate to a point of crisis. And so the term, according to my research, is basically a form of ideological operation that ends up producing a sense of an undifferentiated agent that removes us from any kind of political traction where we can address specificities of the uneven and inequitable understandings of environmental transformation. The fact that, for instance, many people in the global south or indigenous populations who have a very small carbon footprint, for instance, have very little, if any, responsibility for global environmental transformation, which really comes from countries in the developed north through the long history of globalization, of industrialization, which also accompanied the long history of colonization and slavery. So these are parts of the complex history of the formation of climate change as we know it now that the Anthropocene thesis tends to leave out or cover over.
Indigenous communities and global south populations disproportionately paying the price for the climate crisis. One of the things I wanted to also talk to you about is you are such a prolific writer and you have been engaged in this research for so many years. When you think about the book and you think about the audience, who do you want reading your work? Which debates do you want to be informing? Which people do you want to be reaching?
When I was beginning to research and think about this book, it was around 2014, 2015. And by that point, the Anthropocene discourse was really spreading widely into the humanities, what we now call the environmental humanities, and within the art world. And I was noticing already at that time that it was often adopted in very acritical ways. In other words, perpetuated without really thinking about the blind spots and the risks and problems the term raises within art exhibitions and cultural research projects, and also within the environmental humanities in different contexts. So, for instance, in the European context, in Berlin, there's the House of World Cultures. This is an important institution in the city that does a lot of exhibitions that comes out of multiculturalism and post-colonial thinking. And they initiated a large-scale research project on the Anthropocene in 2014 that did much of what I'm talking about. It was a really important place of interdisciplinarity in relationship to the arts taking on thinking that was occurring in the sciences in relationship to environmental transformation. Yet at the same time, it wasn't adding what I'm trying to push for, which is a critical understanding of this term. And this was trickling down into a lot of artistic practices as well. The tendency to pick up on this term, to use it, to enter into an acritical cooperative use with this vocabulary. Against the Anthropocene is a short book, and it's meant to be quite polemical and directly critical in what it's trying to do, in asserting basically ultimately a climate justice approach to thinking about the Anthropocene, which I was inspired to write about partly because there's a lot of artists as well who are insisting on that kind of criticality in relationship to the term. How can we mobilize the Anthropocene or even invent other terms? And there are a multiplicity of other terms that are contenders for also addressing different aspects of our current environmental situation, which are really important. Maybe we can talk about that a little later. The book is intended to intervene within an expanding cultural field that would include what we call the environmental humanities, the environmental arts, and possibly even within scientific discourse as a provocation to try to get people who are invested in this terminology to address some of these other points, which ultimately have to do with big topics such as who decides our future? What is the democratic aspects of scientific knowledge? How can scientific knowledge be shared widely? How can we democratize science so that we can all participate in being stakeholders in the way that our world and our future are defined? UCSC actually is a center for a lot of experimental and interdisciplinary speculative thinking around the Anthropocene. It's very exciting to be in this intellectual and scholarly context where people like Donna Haraway and Anna Tsing and the Science and Justice Center, the Cultural Studies Colloquium, there's a lot of resources where very compelling and critical interdisciplinary thinking is taking place. And my book has, even though I started it right when I was coming to Santa Cruz, it's definitely benefited and entered into a productive synergy with many of those conversations. So I've found that kind of speculative and creative thinking has offered keys to unlocking practices within the cultural sphere where artists very widely all over the world, really, once you begin to research this, it's really quite inspiring in terms of the kinds of creative work that's being done.
Let's talk now actually about the ways in which the art interventions are taking place here.
I'll mention just a few examples quickly that I deal with at a little bit more length in the book. One is the work of, there's a Swiss video researcher, Ursula Biemann, who's entered into a collaboration with a Brazilian spatial politics and research architecture practitioner, Paulo Tavares. And they've produced a project which is video-based, but it's also multimedia, called Forest Law, that investigates the history of oil exploration and drilling in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And they investigate how this has impacted not only the forest, part of Amazonia in that region, but also impacted indigenous communities, micro-minorities, really, people like the Seriaku and the Shuar, who have very different understandings of what nature is, even though they don't even have that term in their indigenous vocabularies. But they view the forest as living, as a subject of being, not an object of expropriation. And they're living in a country also which is really fascinating and interesting, Ecuador, which has recognized the rights of nature in their constitution, even though they have a very complex and in some ways contradictory relationship to what the rights of nature might mean in a progressive sense. At the same time, they have a history of supporting neo-extractivism as well as a form of poverty reduction, but nevertheless, it's caused conflicts with indigenous populations. So forest law is a really fascinating exploration that puts all of this information into creative formulations within the image, within video, within an experimental documentary approach to image making. So that's one example that I think is really amazing. Another one is there's a group called the Laboratory of Insurrectionary Imagination, which I love their name.
That is a great name.
Yeah, they're based in France right now, and they're living in the area called the ZAD, which is the largest autonomous zone in Europe, actually. It began as an anti-airport development project, and it's turned into a zone of experimental living that attempts to explore ways of existing and being social beyond the conditions of neoliberal capitalism. So they've organized a lot of really inspiring projects, including one called Climate Games that attempted to and did intervene in COP21, the UN Climate Summit in Paris in 2015. So this is an example of an artistic project that is also activism, that is seeing the UN Climate Summit for what it is, really a space that has been corrupted by corporate interests, many of them fossil fuel-based interests, and has really failed to live up to the democratic process of what climate solutions might be today. And we know that after more than 20 years of the UN climate summits, year after year, with it more and more agreements, there's still a rising amount of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. So in some ways, it's a failed process that ends up supporting the imperatives of economic growth and a very neoliberal understanding of sustainability. So Climate Games was an action-adventure, online and on the streets, collaborative project that attempted to bring people together and declare what their red lines were for what climate justice would represent today. So I address this in the book as well. It's very different from forest law, completely different geography, different kinds of mediums of intervention and artistic engagements. But those are a couple examples of the very inspiring and diverse artistic work that's being done around attempting to translate the Anthropocene in some ways into a form of a climate justice-based project.
And so you used this term just a minute ago of neoliberal sustainability. So what do you mean when you say neoliberal sustainability? And specifically in terms of the way it's undermining a more radical activist project?
The term sustainability is also very, slippery and complex. I wrote an essay a number of years ago called The Politics of Sustainability, which became a chapter in my book, Decolonizing Nature. And if you research the origins and the beginnings of use of this term, which goes back to the 80s, really, you see that from the very beginning, there was a blur between what we might call ecological sustainability and sustainable development. or economic sustainability. And the two were collapsed together within this term, and that's the reason why I think we see in a lot of sustainability discourse a compromise with the interests of green capitalism. And this is really the problem with the term, is that it's turned into a way that where, any and all fossil fuel-based corporations from BP to ExxonMobil will support the discourse of sustainability. Why? Because ultimately they're defining it through an economic lens. So I think it's important to qualify our terms rather than participating in the linguistic confusion and potential greenwashing around them.
One time I think I was on one of these Chevron, Shell web pages, and they do have sustainability programs, initiatives, the sort of contradictions of that and how much that is really wrapped up in this branding. And also at that point, trying to reclaim its identity as not the bad corporation, because look, we have these sustainability projects. We're helping and collaborating with farmers in these communities, and we don't even need to, but we're doing it anyways. The People of Color Sustainability Group on our campus are really problematizing the word sustainability as Eurocentric and as neoliberal.
That's right. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that's another target in the book. Not only the way in which the Anthropocene as a term has been appropriated and directed in certain ways, but also how environmentalism has its own pitfalls and problems. And again, my basis is in a commitment to environmental justice. And with that term, which really comes out of African-American approaches to environmentalism in this country, where environmentalism isn't a matter of saving the whales or saving the wilderness, but dealing with the inequalities of urbanism, the fact that black people are disproportionately exposed to lead in paint, or to areas of pollution, or landfills, or incinerators. And so the fact that we see the culmination of this in the recent history of what's happened in Flint with the water crisis, or with Black Lives Matter, and the phrase, "I can't breathe," which had to do with a police chokehold when Eric Garner was killed in New York, but also it has to do with the fact that he can't breathe because he has asthma, because as a African-American, he has, again, a disproportionate relation, historically and statistically, to polluting industries. So we're seeing right now a time where air itself, just as water is in the context, say, of Standing Rock, these elements, these fundamental elements of life are effectively being colonized in a way that brings up all sorts of concerns of environmental injustice and violence.
I think even the way that, activists at Standing Rock identified themselves as water defenders, and I thought that was such an important framing, that you are larger than just protecting the environment, that you are actually defending it, and that is in fact your role. You are listening to TJ Demos, professor in the Department of History of Art and Visual Culture here at UC Santa Cruz. He's also the founder and director of the Center for Creative Ecologies and the author of Against the Anthropocene, Visual Culture and Environment Today. Well, I've been really enjoying this conversation, TJ, and I wanted to give you a chance to maybe offer some final comments, because if you can believe it, we're sort of almost running out of time.
It's a big topic, and there's a lot to talk about. One other point I want to make, which is, I think, increasingly significant, and another reason to be against the Anthropocene, at least in its neoliberal guise, is that increasingly it's an ideological mechanism that tends to support geoengineering and techno-fixes as the prioritized approaches to climate solutions. And the more you look into this, the more really fascinating and shocking it becomes. You have organizations and institutes like the Breakthrough Institute, based in Oakland, California, the Anthropocene Institute, the Welcome to the Anthropocene Educational Project. And I've been researching this recently after writing the book. The people who are supporting this, interestingly, are those like Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, or Larry Page and Carl Page of Google, or Bill Gates. In other words, there's a growing convergence between big tech money and support for the Anthropocene in the form of funding geoengineering projects. And right now, the largest scale project that is historically unprecedented, in the sense that this is not a project that's taking place as an experiment in the lab, but actually in our atmosphere, which is, of course, a collective commons, we could say. Who has the right? Geoengineering is a completely unregulated, undemocratic project. But Harvard is performing this experiment right now. One of the funders of this project is Bill Gates. This is an area that we all have to be concerned about, and we have to talk about, is this okay? Are we willing to basically surrender our atmosphere, our world, our future to the neoliberal Anthropocene? So I would say no, we have to reclaim this as a political project, and we can do so through an alliance of the environmental humanities, the sciences, and justice, as well as the arts, in favor of a social justice, environmental justice approach to climate breakdown.
Well, I would say here on Voces Critícas, we would also say no. We would say no. So thank you so much, TJ, for coming on. I really, really enjoyed having this conversation with you. Thank you so, so much. And thank you all for listening to Voces Critícas tonight. Have a good evening.